Now, world powers have failed to agree on a possible ceasefire for the rebel-held district of Eastern Ghouta in Syria. The UN Security Council has postponed a vote until Saturday, with Russia pushing for several amendments to an earlier draft resolution. RT's Caleb Maupin has the latest from New York.
Well, it's been a tough 2 days of rhetoric and negotiations. Now, it all relates to the district of Eastern Ghouta. That's east of Damascus, a suburb that is currently under the control of rebels and terrorists. It's an enclave. And at this point, the Syrian government is trying to retake the city in an anti-terror operation. Now, at this point, the anti-terror operation is being widely criticized by Western leaders. They're reporting that civilians are being killed. Recently, we even heard from U.S. President Donald Trump.
I will say what Russia and what Iran and what Syria have done recently is a humanitarian disgrace. I will tell you that. We're there for one reason. We're there to get ISIS and get rid of ISIS and go home. We're not there for any other reason, and we've largely accomplished our goal. But what those three countries have done to people over the last short period of time is a disgrace.
Now, we have heard from Russian officials regarding the situation there, and they have talked about concerns for civilian life, not wanting people to be harmed, but also pointing out that this is a fight against terrorists and that these terrorists are essentially using the civilians in the area as human shields. So we've also heard Russian officials point out that it's very interesting to hear such harsh criticism coming from the people who recently leveled the cities of Raqqa and Mosul.
We are appalled by the escalation of airstrikes in Eastern Ghouta.
Humanitarian disaster.
Systematic targeting of civilians.
This is hell on earth.
Ongoing slaughter of trapped civilians.
It's about the backers of the Syrian government as well, and we call on all their backers, including Russia, to ensure that this violence stops.
Civilian casualties are a fact of life.
In Iraq and in Syria, people are much more accepting that because it's their city being liberated, they understand what they were suffering.
Civilians will get caught in the crossfire, civilians will get hurt, civilians will get killed.
If you want to liberate your towns and cities, it comes at a price.
It's an unavoidable part of war, and commanders have to press on despite that. The responsibility for civilian casualties in Iraq and Syria lies with ISIS.
We are the good guys, and the innocent people on a battlefield know the difference.
Now, at this point, leaders of the international community are in full agreement that civilian life in Eastern Ghouta is very important and that the conditions are dire. All want to make sure that civilians are safe. However, there are clear disagreements among world leaders about who is to blame for the situation in Eastern Ghouta.
According to the United Nations, more than 300 civilians have been killed in Eastern Ghouta since the airstrikes intensified. The organization's Secretary General has described the situation there as hell on earth. Now, the Assad government has refused to scale back the operation, saying it is targeting terrorist groups that are using Ghouta as a base to shell residential areas of Damascus. 3 people were killed and 15 injured in the latest rebel assault on the Syrian capital on Friday. Political commentator John White says Western powers' reluctance to target terrorists in Ghouta will only add to the suffering of civilians.
Regime change propaganda has entered the realms of the fantastic, wherein groups such as Nusra Front and Jaish al-Islam, which is the dominant faction in Eastern Ghouta, these groups which adhere to the same ideology responsible for 9/11 and a whole litany of terrorist attacks, they're now being depicted as rebels, as partisans of Second World War repute, whereby the Syrian army made up of conscript soldiers drawn from every part of the multicultural and multi-religious mosaic of Syrian society. They're now being painted as a latter-day Waffen-SS, an army of occupation, rather than an army of liberation. So this narrative will continue as Syria comes closer to achieving its complete liberation. And the suffering of the civilians, which no one can deny, is being prolonged by this continued attempt to undermine the attempts of the Syrian government and its allies, particularly Russia, to liberate the country.